At sunset in the Gulf of Oman, an American destroyer spent 6 hours telling one ship to stop. The warnings did not come once. They came over and over in the clipped language of a navy that had already decided what would happen if the answer stayed no, vacate your engine room. Alter course, comply now. The ship kept moving, then the destroyer fired into the engine room, killed the propulsion, and Marines came down from helicopters into the dark. That is the image everybody is going to remember, a giant Iranian-flagged cargo ship dead in the water. Ropes dropping from the sky, Marines landing on steel containers at night. Washington showing the whole region that the blockade is no longer a sentence in a press release. It is now a thing that can shoot, board, seize, and hold. But the real story is not that one ship was boarded. The real story is that Iran, by reopening danger in Hormuz with gunfire on commercial traffic, may have handed Washington exactly the public justification it needed to turn a fragile blockade into a much more aggressive enforcement system. That is the mistake. Not because Iran lacks reasons for what it is doing, not because the Americans are acting from some position of restraint, but because once Iran started firing on ships in and around the strait again, the argument changed. It was no longer just a fight about sanctions, ceasefires, or nuclear terms. It became a fight about whether global shipping can move through the most important energy choke point on Earth without being shot at. And once the question becomes that blunt, the side that can say it is protecting navigation acquires room to escalate. That is the mechanism most people are missing. Iran's logic was understandable. If you make Hormuz dangerous enough, oil jumps, markets panic, insurance costs rise, and political pressure lands on Washington, Europe, and every government dependent on stable fuel prices. That was always the theory. Iran's military cannot outmatch the United States conventionally, so it tries to transmit pain through energy markets and shipping risk. But that strategy only works if the danger remains deniable enough, controlled enough, and selective enough that the world still argues about who is really responsible. Once commercial traffic starts taking fire again, once crews are broadcasting panic, once tankers are turning around in public view, that ambiguity begins to die. And when ambiguity dies in Hormuz, enforcement grows teeth. That is what the boarding of the Tuska showed. Washington was not just stopping one ship. It was announcing a new phase, not simply blockade as pressure. Blockade as conversion. One Iranian escalation converted into a wider American mandate to inspect more ships, seize more cargo, track more routes, and push the contest outward from the narrow strait into the Gulf of Oman, the Arabian Sea, and eventually the longer logistics chain that keeps Iran's trade alive. That is why this matters more than the ship itself. If you only look at the spectacle, you miss the trap. I think the best way to understand the current moment is with a framework I would call the conversion trap. Iran wanted to convert shipping fear into political leverage. The United States is now trying to convert that same fear into operational permission. Same waterway, same crisis, opposite direction. And once you see that, the whole board looks different. The American buildup in and around Hormuz is no longer just symbolic muscle. It is being assembled as a layered system. Destroyers for interception, boarding teams for seizure, amphibious platforms for opposed entry, helicopters for fast insertion, carrier air wings for cover, patrol aircraft for maritime tracking, drones and sensor networks to reduce the space in which a vessel can disappear. That matters because the old Iranian advantage in Hormuz was never based on defeating the United States in a straight military contest. It was based on clutter, confusion, speed, surprise, deniability, and narrow geography, swarms, mines, coastal missiles, drones, sudden warning fire, selective passage, selective pressure. What Washington is trying to do now is strip away that ambiguity layer by layer, not by solving every problem, not by making risk disappear, but by making invisibility harder, evasion harder, and selective enforcement easier. If that process succeeds even partially, then Iran's leverage shrinks in a very specific way. It does not disappear, it turns poisonous. And poisonous leverage is dangerous because it still exists, but every use of it carries a higher self-inflicted cost than before. That is where Tehran may now be trapped. Iran still has options, but look closely at the options tree. and you start to see why this moment is so dangerous for them. Option 1 is to keep raising the temperature in Hormuz. More warning fire, more harassment, more drones, more attempts to show that no blockade can really function without Iranian tolerance that preserves the image of defiance. But it also gives Washington more justification to widen seizures, tighten interdiction, and internationalize the claim that Iran is the actor making civilian shipping unsafe. In other words, every act of pressure starts creating permission for the other side. Option 2 is to pull back and reduce visible disruption. That could lower the immediate risk of broader American action. It could buy time. It could preserve room for talks. But it would also look inside Iran and across the region like backing down immediately after drawing a line. And in a regime whose hardline factions survive on the claim that force earns respect, while compromise invites predation, visible retreat carries its own cost. Option 3 is to escalate asymmetrically while avoiding direct signature, mines, deniable attacks, proxy action, harassment in adjacent waters, pressure on routes beyond Hormuz itself. That is the most familiar Iranian playbook. But even that route is narrower than it used to be because the more the United States pushes boarding authority and surveillance outward, the more Tehran risks transforming a localized chokepoint crisis into a broader contest over smuggling, sanctions, and proxy supply lines. Once the Americans start framing this not just as freedom of navigation, but as the interruption of weapons routes and illicit trade, the campaign acquires a second rationale. And second rationales are harder to roll back than first ones. Option 4 is to make concessions in talks while projecting strength on the surface. That is probably the least dramatic path, and for that reason, the hardest to sell domestically, especially if different Iranian power centers are not fully aligned, especially if the diplomats are negotiating one reality while the security apparatus performs another, especially if every public walkback becomes evidence that the state does not speak with one voice, and that internal fracture matters, because one of the most important stories in this entire crisis is that America is not really dealing with one Iran. It is dealing with a diplomatic Iran that still wants a controlled exit and a security Iran that distrusts the very premise of a controlled exit. The more the crisis sharpens, the more those two Irans collide. A foreign minister can suggest a narrower path. A guard commander can close it again. A parliament figure can sound uncompromising in one breath and signal progress in another. That is not a side detail. That is one of the central facts of the negotiation. A state divided between survival logic and defiance logic becomes much easier to provoke and much harder to settle with. Now add the outer layer. China, the outer layer matters because a blockade is only as strong as its ability to produce real economic pain. And over the last decade, China helped build exactly the kind of architecture that prevents American pressure from becoming immediate Iranian collapse. Dark fleet tankers, payment routes outside the dollar system. Chinese buying capacity, storage, transshipment. The whole quiet machinery that allows oil and money to keep moving, even when Washington claims the door is closing. That means the Americans can make life harder for Iran without necessarily forcing the kind of rapid capitulation that makes a clean diplomatic victory possible. And that means time behaves differently here. Time does not automatically work for the side with more visible force. Sometimes time works for the side that can absorb punishment, preserve ambiguity, and keep a patron or purchaser in the background. But here's the twist. China's architecture may keep Iran from collapsing. It does not automatically keep Iran from making a strategic miscalculation. That is the point. Support systems can prevent economic suffocation. They cannot always prevent political overreach. And what the boarding of the Tuska suggests is that Tehran may have crossed exactly that line from using Hormuz as a lever to using Hormuz in a way that lets Washington recode the whole conflict before the story was pressure. Now, the story can be enforcement before the story was markets and brinkmanship. Now, the story is armed disruption of shipping and the right to physically stop vessels before the blockade risks looking partial contested and politically awkward. Now it risks looking brutal but clearer that is a meaningful shift. And if you want to understand why Islamabad matters so much in this context, it is because talks held under these conditions are no longer occurring with old atmosphere. They are occurring after a visible boarding, after public warnings, after new military signaling, after the demonstration that Washington is willing to act on camera and not just threaten to act. That changes the emotional geometry of negotiation, even if the underlying demands stay similar. Iran now has to calculate under a different sky, not just whether the United States can impose costs, not just whether global markets will move, but whether each move made in Hormuz is now accelerating a campaign that will progressively reduce Tehran's room to use the waterway on its own terms. That is why I do not think the real issue is whether one ship got boarded. The real issue is whether Iran just transformed Hormuz from a bargaining chip into a justification machine for its opponent. If that transformation is real, then this was not just a dramatic night operation, it was a strategic turning point. Because in a chokepoint crisis, the side that loses control of the story usually starts losing control of the corridor. And once that happens, every next move gets more expensive than the last. The opening scene was Marines dropping out of helicopters into the dark. The deeper story is that Iran may have fired the shots that made that scene possible. And if that is true, then the red line it crossed was not American. It was its own. The moment a choke point stops being your leverage and starts becoming the other side's permission, you are no longer shaping the crisis. You are feeding it.